Okay, we're underway. Hello, Carol. How are you?
I'm great.
I am Glenn Loury, and I'm with Dr. Carol Swain. I will introduce her in a moment, but I want you to know that I am a professor of economics and of international public affairs at Brown University. This is the Glenn Show. And the Watson Institute for International Public Affairs sponsors the Glenn Show. So I'm with Carol Swain. Carol, I'm just excited about being able to interview on my podcast. Thank you for coming on.
We go way back.
We go way back. When did we first meet? I think it was in the 80s, right? When you were an assistant professor at Princeton?
No, I contacted you when I was a graduate. No, I believe I was an undergraduate at Roanoke College, and my professor had introduced me to your writings and Thomas Sowell's. Maybe I was introduced to the writings, and then I contacted you as a graduate student.
That's a long time ago. Me and Thomas Sowell. So I guess it was the Black conservatives that whoever introduced you to us was introducing you to.
And Walter Williams, and it was a white Republican, a professor who told me.
Oh, it was William Keach, wasn't it?
No, it was Bill Hill at Roanoke College in Salem, Virginia.
I beg your pardon.
And he was a professor of public affairs, and, you know, it's a small school, so he taught a lot of things. He taught philosophy and various things. And he had been my advisor when I transferred from the community college. And I remember his telling me that, telling me not to expect to do as well at Roanoke College as I had done in the past. And to me, that was like throwing the gauntlet down. And so I signed up for his classes, even though all the Black students told me he was a racist and that I should avoid him. And they gave me a list of all the racist professors, and he was on it. And so my pattern was, whenever I was told to avoid a professor, I took their courses and tried to, you know, impress them by doing my best. And I ended up getting a B+ in the first class I took with him. And then after that, I got all A's.
Okay, so he was telling you that there was going to be no affirmative action, no favoritism. This was going to be tough, and you rose to the challenge and went ahead and excelled anyway.
Well, I mean, he was just preparing me for Roanoke College because it was a private Lutheran school, and he was telling me that with my community college and high school dropout background, that I shouldn't expect to do as well as I'd done in the past. So he was sincerely trying to prepare me for what I would encounter. And the very first paper that I wrote as an undergraduate was on affirmative action. I think I still have a copy of it.
You're lucky if you still have your papers from all those years ago.
Well, I got
you went on to Virginia Tech and then to UNC, is that correct?
Yes, and I never sought to get a PhD. Like, I had transferred from the community college where I studied business. Initially, I was interested in art. I have a lot of art talent, so I wanted to be a commercial artist, and I was told to be practical. And I was always a person who mentored well. Whenever people told me what I needed to do to be successful, I would find the best person I could identify in that field, and then I would do whatever advice they gave me. But they told me not to take, that I needed to take something other than art. So I chose business merchandising. So I have a degree in business, 1 in criminal justice, 2 in political science, and then a master's in law from Yale that I earned after I finished my PhD and been a professor for about 10 years.
You did a PhD in political science at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. And your first job after that was at Princeton as an assistant professor of politics?
Yes. In fact, I've only had 2 jobs in academia, Princeton and Vanderbilt.
You ended up with tenure at Princeton as a tenured associate professor, and you published a path-breaking book, Black Faces, Black Interest.
Yes, and I have to tell you that I got early tenure, and when I was hired, I told them that I was going to get early tenure. And John DiIulio was head of my search committee, and he had achieved tenure in 1 year, and I thought if he did it in 1 year, I could certainly do it in 3. And so by the 3rd year at Princeton, I had outside offers of tenure. And so I used that to negotiate early tenure. So instead of 7 years, I did it in 3. Went up in the 3rd year, got it in the 4th.
This is the highest level of academic political science in the country, indeed, in the world. And you were a superstar at a very young age. What was the argument of blackface is black interest?
Well, during the time I was in graduate school, 1980s, there was this argument that only blacks could represent black interests. And blackface is black interest started out as a dissertation because I asked, is this true that only blacks can represent black interests? And so as part of that study, and that is when I contacted you, because I had to I had to come up with an indicator for black interests. And so you were very helpful helping me think that through. And I concluded that political party was more important than the race of the representative, and that as long as blacks held the views they did, they'd best be represented by Democrats. Consequently, it didn't make sense to draw majority black districts. And what was path-breaking about the book is that I identified the trade-off between black faces, having more black faces in office, and black interests. You could have more black people and have less representation of your policy goals. I was also in the forefront of making the argument that whites would support black candidates, and when black candidates lost, it wasn't because of their race, that they were losing because of their views, that they were so liberal. And the book caught a lot of people's attention. It was published in 1993 and updated in 1995 because I had a chapter that discussed what would happen if Democrats lost control of the Congress. And so I painted a picture of what actually happened a year after. And people had never anticipated, because Democrats had controlled the Congress for over 40 years. And so no one thought it could happen, but my book painted this picture of it could happen, and that drawing the majority black districts was not a way to increase black representation, that was a trade-off that they were making.
I want to try something on you, see how you react to it, because Stacey Abrams' name is very much in the news these days. This is the woman who narrowly lost in a gubernatorial campaign in Georgia, and who is on the short list to become the Vice President Biden's running mate. Anyway, who lost to, is it Brian Kemp? Is that the guy's name?
Yes.
In Georgia, and refused to concede the election on voter suppression arguments. And here's the provocative proposition I want to put in front of you, Professor Swain. It is this. If Stacey Abrams had been pro-life, she'd be governor of Georgia right now. Okay? So, therefore, if all of the people who are hollering about black people not getting a voice want to have a voice in the South, all they have to do is untether themselves from the left wing of the Democratic Party and reflect the historically resonant moral position of black people who are largely reverent Christian people, by standing up for values that are not inconsistent with the interests of blacks, but rather are an authentic expression of those interests. She'd be governor of Georgia right now. So while she's running around blaming racists for blocking black people from getting to the ballot box, she's the one who's not representing black people.
Well, I mean, you could argue that's the entire civil rights leadership. Back, in the early days, Jesse Jackson and Al Sharpton were pro-life. And you think about the millions of black babies that have been aborted over the decades, they would be voters now. We would be the largest minority in the country, as opposed to the Hispanics today, because we have killed off so many, potential black voters. And so that is very problematic. And it seems that with black women, so many of them have been captured by white, liberal, feminist politics. And it's not in the interest of blacks. And I think that black men, more of them are woke as to what is happening. And as a consequence, President Trump, or candidate Trump, in 2016 got more of the votes of Black men than Black women. Black women, they are really deceived. They're working against their own self-interest.
Okay, now we're way out there, and a lot of people are going to say this is far-right, crazy talk, but I want to persist for a moment. I mean, on a number of things. You just invoked the personhood of the unborn babies who are aborted by African-American women exercising their quote-unquote right to choose. You just invoked that. You put that in the context
they have a right to choose in the sense that they are just trapped in so many ways with the abortion clinics in their communities and the Black leaders pushing that it's okay and the church being silent. And so they are deceived, and it's detrimental to the population. And if the Republicans were doing to Black people what the Democrats are doing, we would call it genocide, because it is genocidal.
You just called abortion Black voter suppression. That's what you just did, Carol. And here's the thing that I find most provocative about this, and I'm not unsympathetic to your position. I'm just going to say that. I know people get angry, but I'm not concerned about that right now. Here's the thing that I find most interesting about it. The question on the table is, what are Black interests? What are actually Black interests? Pardon?
To be alive, to make a living, to pursue life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
But they're going to talk about the autonomy. There's going to be a pro-choice argument here. They're going to talk about the woman's autonomy, about her freedom from being told what to do with her body. And they're going to say that Black women would have been burdened with the consequences of a pro-life position that would, in fundamental ways, violate the rights of women to be in control of what happens to their bodies.
Glenn, aren't you glad that our mothers didn't look at whether or not we would be a burden when they found themselves pregnant with us? Yes. I'm one of 12 children. My mother didn't abort any of her children. And I'm the only one that made it, into the middle class and had a profession. But the rest of them, they do okay. And so I think if you were to interview any of them, they would not say it would have been better off if our mother had exercised her right to choose and had eliminated some of us.
Do you agree with my supposition that Stacey Abrams would be governor of Georgia right now if she had come out pro-life?
Well, she were pro-life, she'd be a Republican, and so she would probably be governor.
A Republican like you.
Christian, and I would have been out there working for her. Campaigning for her, making
a born-again Christian like you.
Values.
A born-again Christian. Do you ever give your testimony, Carol, about what happened in your life, how you met Jesus?
I have, and I had a late conversion. It was after I earned my tenure at Princeton, and I was a single-minded seeker of tenure. That was my entire focus. And then after I had the tenure, I was so disillusioned that I had, that this was all there was to it. And so for me, after I got tenure, I became depressed, and there was this downward spiral that sent me seeking, a religious solution, I guess. And so it took me through New Age, Eastern religions. I went all kinds of places before I ended up having an experience in a medical hospital that I share sometimes, but that was the beginning of my conversion. And this was a hospital in Princeton where I thought I was dying. It was like my life was being played out in front of me, and I was sure I was dying. Of course, I didn't, but there was a Black Pentecostal chaplain at that hospital, which is odd. Princeton is not the kind of community that would have a Black Pentecostal chaplain at the hospital that everyone used. But he was there, and there was a cleaning lady that threw a book in my bed about Jesus. Little thin book about Jesus. And that was the beginning, but it took a few years for me to really know what it meant to be a Christian. And so in 1999, and this was after I had accepted the job at Vanderbilt, but before I actually showed up, I went to New Haven to get that 5th degree in law. And that very first week, I asked someone, to recommend a church because I felt like at that point I was not a churchgoer, but I was more spiritual. And I thought that I should go to a church and give some money. And I wanted a little inner city church because I knew their needs were great. And so I sat in the back of that church waiting for them to pass the offering. But somehow I ended up answering the altar call. And so I was at the altar and tears, that I didn't expect. And I was very confused because I've always been in control. And I had a plan for that day. And that plan was to sit in the back of the church when the offering plate came by to put my check in, but somehow I ended up at the altar, sobbing. And so I was very puzzled. Went back the next week, same thing. Third week, a woman came up behind me and she put her hand on my shoulder and she said, God tells me that you need a mother. And while you're in New Haven, I'm going to be your mother. And at that moment, I knew it was God because I'm second from the oldest of 12 children. And I've always felt like I didn't have a mother. Even though my mother lives with me now, I've always felt like I didn't have a mother. And I was always looking for a mother by hanging out with older women.
Excuse me, was it a Black church?
Yeah, it was a little Black inner city church. And I became a regular churchgoer, and the pastor was female. I think the name of it was Faith Temple. And she kind of took me under her wing. And then I went to a second Black church while I was in New Haven. And there I became a devout believer. In that year that I earned the master's degree in law at Yale, I was active in the Black church. And when I moved to Nashville, I was literally not the person they hired in 1998. And I told my dean that something had happened in New Haven and I was not the person they hired. And I thought God was going to call me into the ministry and I was going to have this life. That did not happen. I ended up publishing a book that I was working on, The New White Nationalism.
I want to get to that.
Yeah, I wanted God to bring me from academia.
Okay. I'm sorry. Go ahead, please.
I'm sorry. Well, I'm just telling you, when I came to Nashville, when I moved there in 2000, I came as a born-again, on-fire Christian. And that doesn't mean I proselytized in the classroom. I never did any of that. But I kept waiting for God to move me out of academia. And I was very bold in The New White Nationalism because I thought that would be my last academic book. It was, and that may be true because my other books have been more popular.
Carol, hold on a minute. I want to talk about the New White Nationalism at length, but I want to ask you about being a Christian in the academy.
Okay.
Because that's territory that I have some familiarity with myself from my own personal experience. And it's also in some ways very rare at, the more sort of rarefied ranks of academia to see publicly confessing Christians talking about their faith. And I wonder how it, in your case, has been received by your colleagues and your students and how it's affected your own perception of your work. I know that you have retired from Vanderbilt now, but you had a long career there, almost 20 years, and you taught also at Princeton. How is it that this conversion experience of yours affected the way people reacted to you, and how is it that you've affected how you looked at your own work?
Well, I can tell you that at Vanderbilt was when I became a public devout Christian, that people knew that I was Christian. And when I told the dean that something happened while I was in New Haven and that I was not the person they hired, that particular dean of the law school said, I would do everything in my power to protect you. And so immediately, I was this person in need of protection. I had assumed that God was going to move me out of academia and I would not be there that long. I can tell you that I've never won a national prize since then. The outside job offers ended. And I had a dean tell me that my faith was standing in the way of my career. And I asked him if any students or any colleagues had complained about me, and he said no. And I knew that I was not proselytizing in the classroom, but on the first day of class, when we introduce ourselves to students, I would tell them about my background, and they would know that I'm Christian because I believe in truth in advertising. I believe, that people need to know who they're in the classroom with during the drop ad period. And so it made things very difficult. But
you're saying that you feel that you've been discriminated against because of your faith?
I'm not going to publicly say that. But of course, I was treated differently, and job offers ended. And people, they look at my distinguished career. I've won the highest prize in the profession that a political scientist can win. It's the career prize, that Woodrow Wilson Prize, that if you are a white scholar, if you're a white male, if you are white and you win that prize, it's like the Nobel Prize for political scientists. It didn't do a lot for me because I'm Black, and maybe it was because of affirmative action and the fact that I'm Christian. But I can say that I won, 3 national prizes, but none from academia after I became a Christian. And then with my books that I've written since then, they are not likely to get reviewed. They don't get reviewed in the same way. And so
those prizes were for
discrimination.
Excuse me, I just want to be sure I understand. Those prizes were for Black Faces, Black Interests?
The 3 national prizes, but the New White Nationalism, was nominated by the publisher for a Pulitzer Prize. And that book did not do as well as it should have done because it didn't get reviewed in the way that Black Faces, Black Interests got reviewed. People accused me of being a sensationalist, and they just did not like the message of that book.
Okay, so what year is that book?
2002.
All right. Now, why I've read, there's a very nice in-depth profile of your academic work that I saw at the Weekly Standard, which I was very impressed by, because the writers seem to appreciate the significance of these 2 books. We've talked about Black Faces, Black Interests. You anticipate and predict something that actually comes to pass within a decade of the publication of your book, which is the rise of this resentment-fueled and angry identitarian movement amongst white conservatives or white nationalists. And please correct me if I don't characterize this in an appropriate manner. But what do you observe in the book? What do you see happening, and how is it that it is regarded now as having been prescient?
Well, I have to tell you that was the first book I wrote after I had my conversion experience. And I was working on a different book, Glenn, and you're responsible for me switching my focus, because I was working on a book on affirmative action. And if you read The New White Nationalism, it has, maybe 550 pages. It's a long book, because I ended up folding my affirmative action research into The New White Nationalism. But my book before I had an encounter with you at a conference was about when Blacks and whites agree, fairness and opportunities. And I had done some experimental research that showed if you presented people with concrete situations through vignettes, that whites and Blacks would agree on what was fair, even to the point that Black people might select a white hypothetical student over a Black student if that person had a particular profile. And so I found tremendous agreement between whites and Blacks. And I felt like all the division that we were talking about during that time between Blacks and whites over race, that was and on affirmative action, that was part of an artifact of the way we asked the questions, that if you gave people with people real situations, that they would agree. So, I thought that was significant. And this was during the time that Bowen and Bach wrote The Shape of the River, and everyone was talking about affirmative action. And I was so excited because I had the solution. And
and what was my objection, Carol? I'm sorry, I don't even remember.
I'm going to get to your objection, but the thing about it is that the world did not receive me in the same way, because the elites, they were ready for the message of Black Faces, Black Interests. But when it came to the fact that I was arguing against race-based affirmative action and more towards class-based, merit-based affirmative action, they were not ready for that. But your objection, you said to me, like, so what? who cares if whites and blacks agree? We have serious problems in this world. And I can't remember, more. That's all I remember you saying. But I remember myself being deeply wounded and going home and then becoming aware at this point in time, and you may recall this, there were high-profile incidents taking place of people going out and shooting others of different race, whether it was a white going out, killing a bunch of blacks, or Jews, or a black man that went out and shot white men. All of these, a college student from the University of Illinois that had been recruited to a hate group that went and he killed two people. He shot at 11. All of that was taking place, and I became very curious about what causes a person to hate to the level that they'd want to take someone's life. And I realized that to get that information, you would have to interview the people. And obviously, I couldn't interview them, I could not interview them for obvious reasons, because we're talking about white nationalists. I identified 10 for a case study, and I used a white researcher with a PhD that was also at Princeton. I started the research.
This is Russ Neely.
Yes, and so he contacted these individuals. Not a single one said no. He told them he was working with a Princeton professor. Not a single one asked, who are you working with? And they signed 3 releases without asking who he was working with. And some of those, like William Pierce, the guy that wrote the Turner Diaries and a book called The Hunter, and he started the National Alliance, he had a policy of not giving interviews to blacks and Jews. And he was the one that I feared the most. And the year that the book was published and it started getting attention, he died within 2 months. And boy, was I relieved.
Now, you interviewed Jared Taylor in this as well, did you not?
Yeah, and I tell you, I have a lot of respect for Jared Taylor. And what I respect about him is his honesty. And
now, this is the guy that thinks black people are genetically inferior in terms of intellect, isn't it?
Yes, that's the argument he makes. What I find fascinating about Jared Taylor is that he's the child of Christian missionaries, and he was raised in Japan, and that's a very ethnocentric community where he was an outsider. And
but Carol, as a black woman, how can you have respect for somebody who thinks blacks are genetically inferior?
I have respect for people that are willing to make that case, provide whatever data that they can marshal. And my interactions with him have been, very pleasant. Now, he would deny this today, but when I published my book, he called me to compliment me by the fact that I had fairly presented the case, and that he had thought that all blacks hated white people until he encountered me. And as a Christian, and at that point I was a Christian, it meant a lot to me that at least I had opened this man's eyes up to the fact that no, blacks don't hate whites. Some of the issues that he raised, to me, he's the most important subject in the whole book, because of the fact that he is an intellectual. He has a degree from Yale and the London School of Economics. He makes a very logical, rational case for his position. And I felt like if I were some white kid from Appalachia, especially if I were a white male, that I could be persuaded by his arguments. And so I knew he was very dangerous, that he had an argument that would resonate with the wider population. And the issues that I identified in the book, many of those issues are still around. I felt like that if mainstream politicians did not address those issues, that people who had voices that were more extreme, that they would be able to persuade large numbers of people, to their way of thinking. And with Jared Taylor, he doesn't espouse violence. He uses social science data, FBI statistics, IQ data to make his case.
Yeah, I've encountered Jared Taylor. I don't say I know him in the sense of interviewed him or had a long conversation, but I've encountered him on more than one occasion. most recently in Washington, D.C., at a conference that the Manhattan Institute sponsored, where after I had made some remarks, he challenged me as to whether or not I was open to entertaining the question of genetic influences on social outcomes. To which I responded, for the record, that yes, of course, I was open. I agreed that that's a very fundamental issue about free expression and inquiry and, what civil society is supposed to be. And you don't get to rule certain questions of fact out of bounds a priori just because they make you squirm in your seat or they disquiet people. I agree with them about that. But I went on to say that I did not agree as a social scientist that the weight of the evidence was in support of the hereditarian point of view as a significant determinant of social inequality. To say that it plays a role around the margins is one thing. To say that it's a significant and constraining factor on what we do is another. That was my position, and I just wanted to put that on the record. But the new...
Let me tell you something about him.
Yeah, go ahead.
About him. He argued that Black people that had an advantage in the sense that they had leaders to speak up for them, and that white people needed leaders that would be similar to Jesse Jackson and Al Sharpton. And he has spent a lot of time, as you know, focusing on Black crime and the fact when there are heinous crimes against white people that they don't get the same type of media coverage. And so I think that...
what do you think about that? Do you think that white people need spokespersons to speak up for them as whites?
Well, I think they're speaking up.
Harping on Black on white crime is a healthy thing for our society?
I think that Black people, we need to be harping on the Black crime rate. And when we see Black on white crime and vicious things taking place and a double standard, we should be speaking up about it. Someone should speak up about it. And I think that what Jared Taylor does is he points out the hypocrisy of the white liberals and how they're very comfortable in New York and probably, New York, Boston, around the country in their all-white gatherings with their one token Black. And that's true. We know it's true. And so a lot of what he has said resonates with me, but I knew that I was on to something when I heard him put together his argument, because the rest of the world, they're focused on white supremacists and white nationalists. They were focused on the KKK, the neo-Nazis, the people that are real losers. They're never going to get a large following. But when you have someone who's an intellectual and they're making a rational case, I think it will reach a lot of young people, and it has the potential to persuade the masses, because what I saw in the interviews and the other research that I did to supplement those interviews is that many people who don't hate Black people were concerned about their own families, and they felt that discrimination was wrong. White people were being discriminated against, and that there was no one standing up for white people. And so I think that in a perfect society, we would want to address the grievances that they might have about racial preferences. And one way that could have been addressed would be a move away from race-based policies to policies that were more need-based and need.
Okay, so I got to ask you something, Carol. This concern, this is going to be the main argument, isn't it, against the new white nationalism? This is where the charge that you're an apologist for white nationalists comes from, isn't it? Which is this.
But we may not be talking about the same thing. We're talking about white nationalism, because I titled my book, or Cambridge titled it, I don't know, because they didn't use the title that I recommended, but it's called The New White Nationalism, to distinguish it from old style white supremacy and the white nationalism that was violent. And so what I saw and that would resonate with the wider population was the fact that these people were saying it's wrong to discriminate against anyone. It's against the civil rights laws. It's against the Constitution. Whites are being discriminated against. There's no one speaking up for whites. That was part of their argument. And then the young people point to the racial double standards, the fact that on college and university campuses, they have all of these little ethnic centers, but white people, as white people, that if they do anything that looks like they're organizing on the basis of ethnicity, even if it's a social group, then that is treated differently.
But here's the argument.
But wait a minute, you also have to look at it like one reason I got this right in that book is that whites are becoming a minority in the United States, and I expected them to act like other racial and ethnic minority groups, and so that's what we see.
Okay, no, here, let me make this counter argument because I hear you.
Okay,
and I'm not unsympathetic to what you're saying personally. I've said similar things myself. How are you going to expect to have a constant political conversation that's racialized, and white people are not going to have a race and an interest in that conversation? That's unreasonable. It's unreasonable as a behavioral claim to expect that they are going to sit by unaware of being white while you constantly frame everything that's happening in society in terms of being black or being of color. So I take that point, but here's the counter argument that I can imagine somebody trying to make, which is history is not neutral here. In other words, we live in the midst at the early part of the 21st century, we live amidst the consequences of a very long train of events, and they are not neutral with respect to whiteness. The evocation of whiteness, of white nationalism, of white identity is a qualitatively different and more dangerous phenomenon. You can expect that the people underneath the oppressive consequences of history will identify as victims of it. But to have the oppressors identify and to define themselves as victim, even as the structures of power continue to allow them to hold people back, come on, racial slavery? You're going to compare affirmative? I'm not saying you personally. What a person of this inclination is going to compare the affront to white people of affirmative action in the 21st century to the affront to black people of the whole long history of racial domination. So you're going to let a genie out of the bottle here. If you allow that equation, that's a kind of moral equivalency. If you allow that equation to pass, you're letting a genie out of the bottle here, and it can only come back to hurt people of color.
Well, I mean, there's so much that you've said there, and then I guess I put on my Christian hat now, and that has to do with I believe in God's providence. And you and I both, I guess you may know your ancestry, but if we do one of those DNA tests, we have plenty of Caucasian, all of this blood in our cells. And you go back to the debate between Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois, and we know who won that debate, but the principles and values that Booker T. Washington and many blacks, throughout the generations espoused, put them on a better path than we are on today. And I think with white people becoming a minority throughout the country and America being the kind of nation it is, that we're better off, and as my book argues, moving away from identity politics towards the American national identity. And in that book, The New White Nationalism, I talk about white interests and white consciousness being the next phase of identity politics in America. So that was one of the things in 2002 I got right. And I felt like the solution involved white people and black people, that white people and black people had certain things they had to do. And part of it was to move away from the identity politics and the multiculturalism and to start looking in terms of what benefits America as a whole.
How you think that's going?
I don't think we're there yet, and I think we're making serious mistakes. I think this diversity, inclusion, industry that's affecting corporations as well as colleges and universities, and recent decisions by the UC California system to move away from testing. I think that all of that is to the detriment of Black people, and that we're not doing very well at all. I think that too much power has been given to those voices of division. And I think that if America is to stand strong and if our people are to be, able to compete in the world, we have to move away from the identity politics that is very destructive.
Well, I got to ask you.
One more thing. I think right now that we are at a period of time where you see a lot of reverse discrimination against whites. The things that people are able to do to white young people, what professors say to them in the classroom, what they do to them during orientation. If you're a Christian, if you're white, especially a white male, they would not tolerate that against any other group. I mean, and like,
for example, give me an example.
They're all my children. They're all my children.
Give me an example of what you're talking about in terms of the abuse of white males in an orientation program and of Christians.
Well, I can tell you that what I have experienced is that orientation week or that orientation process is like a cultural shock. And that part of what they try to do, if it's a child that comes from a Christian home, they try to shock them with the institutional values that will be as progressive as they can be. And if you are white, you're privileged. No matter if you came from Appalachia and you come from 3 generations of coal miners and maids and waitresses, you're privileged because of the color of your skin. You are an oppressor. You're responsible for everything bad that's happened in the world. You're told that. And they try to shame you because of the color of your skin or the fact that you believe in God. We would not allow that to happen to any other group. And I think it's wrong. I think to stand up to it.
I got to ask you this. So one of the issues is going to be the moral status of homosexuality. It's going to be gay marriage. It's going to be gay adoption. The progressive line, the accepted moral judgment is that to be, skeptical about the moral status of homosexuality or hostile to it as a moral position based on your faith is bigotry against homosexuals, and it would have no place in almost any of these academic venues that I can imagine. What do you say to that?
I can tell you that what a lot of schools do for orientation is they get the most flamboyant gay person they can find, and they put that person out front. And they make it very clear that if you come from a background where you believe, that homosexuality is a sin, you and your values are not welcome here. So they do all of that. I think
because they want the gay student to feel safe and valued in the environment.
And in the process, they have to destroy students that don't share those beliefs or intimidate them to the point that they live in fear. And it seems to me that we can coexist. And I don't know any Christians in any churches that I've ever attended that hate gays or wish them ill will. But I believe that we can't say that on the other side. And then from my own experiences, like I took early retirement from Vanderbilt. I'm not at liberty to go into details about all of the factors that went into that. But I can tell you that I watched the university become more and more progressive. And by university, I mean universities in America. And I would say...
And you don't mean that as a compliment either.
No, because I don't think there are marketplaces of ideas anymore, and that they don't expose the students to critical thinking skills, that they have become factories for indoctrination. And so I don't believe our children are being well educated. And the travesty is the amount of money that parents are paying to send their children there. If their children come from traditional homes with traditional values, they're sending them into an unsafe place where every effort will be made to destroy those children, everything they believe, and turn them into something else. And so I think that is to the detriment. And you look at me, like I'm a high school dropout, first generation, college student. While I was at the community college, I started as a work study student, ended up being hired for a full-time job, nights and weekends, worked full-time while I was at Roanoke College, graduated magna cum laude, working a full-time job, bringing my children in at night because I worked in the library, and so they could sit at a table while I was working. I've done all that, became a successful professor, and the left has done everything possible to destroy me and to keep me away from young people. They don't want me to share the secrets of success. that made it possible for me to overcome my poverty, they don't want that to be known. I'm a threat. I have nothing of value because I am a person who was never big into the feminist movement. And then because I don't share the views of liberal Blacks, I have no value to the world.
Well, you have a great deal of value, Carol Swain. I'll certainly say that. And I've got some more things that I want to discuss with you, so I'm not in a hurry to end this conversation. You remind me, however, did you see this recently released film about Justice Clarence Thomas, Created Equal? You remind me in more than a small degree of the story of Clarence Thomas. It's not a very dissimilar story. Carol, you all are both from the southeast of the United States. You both came up poor. You're both extraordinary African-American conservative people. Clarence Thomas is not an academic, but he is the longest serving justice of the United States Supreme Court. You have a very distinguished academic career. I can't get over these two blockbuster books. Now, two blockbuster books, Black Faces, Black Interests, and now The New White Nationalism. And I want to ask you this. Do you think we are winning or losing? By we, I mean those African-American intellectuals like you and me who cut across the grain. We're different. We don't believe the same things in every regard, but there are some similarities, and who cut across the grain of thinking that is popular amongst African-American elites. Do you think we're losing or we're winning?
I think that the answer can be found in Joe Biden's comment that you ain't Black, if you don't support him, that they have figured out a way, the progressives that run, large parts of the world, to take people like us who are conservative and who are different and Black and say that we don't count, that we're just like unicorns. So in that sense,
so we're losing.
Well, I don't know that if we're losing alongside a lot of other conservatives. And when you talk about my books, like the two books that I wrote, for academics, I also wrote in 2011 a book, Black Faces, Black Interest, not Black Faces, Black Interest, Be the People, a call to reclaim America's faith and promise. And in that book, I don't know it.
Forgive me. I don't know that book.
I think that book is very important. And then a couple of years ago, I co-authored a book with a man that had been a pastor, Abduction, How Liberalism Steals the Hearts and Minds of Our Children, to inform parents about some of the things that are taking place, in public and private schools. That's all about stripping our children of the values we put in them and instilling their own values. And so all of these things are taking place. The American people, whether they are white or Black, are not as informed as they should be. And when it comes to Black people like us and where we stand, I think that it is very important for us to be self-sacrificial. And my faith enables me, to stand strong. And I believe, that God knows us before we are born. He orders our footsteps. I worked in nursing homes before I started college. I wanted to go to nursing school, and I could have become a nurse. I didn't get admitted to nursing school, and I believe that's because God had a different path for me. And I believe that my story is not about me. It's much bigger than me. It's meant to be shared, just like your story, and that we have an obligation to share our knowledge, to the world. And it's not easy, to be a Black conservative, but I feel, very blessed. In a way, I feel chosen. I feel like I'm on a mission, and it doesn't matter, what the world does to me. I don't believe that, that my fate is in human hands.
I got to ask you about Donald J. Trump. You serve on the National Advisory Board of Black Voices for Trump, if I'm not mistaken. You are an open, out of the closet, overt, and unreconstructed Trump supporter. Can you please explain yourself to the rest of America?
Well, the most important thing for me to explain is that I've spent my life avoiding Black stuff. Like, I just wanted to be a political scientist. I wanted to be the best political scientist I could be. And I was not active in the Black Student Union. Bless you.
Excuse me. Thank you.
Bless you. Bless you. I was not active in the Black student unions. I was not active in Black things. I didn't want to be a Black something. I just wanted to be me. And so when Black Voices for Trump approached me, it was not an easy decision to affiliate with something that was exclusively Black. But I realized that whether it's the Democratic Party or the Republican Party, that you have to fit in a box. And so I even had someone tell me, which box do you fit in? Do you want to be in the religious box? Because I'm a person of strong faith, I could be in the religious box. Well, God didn't call me to be exclusively in the religious box. But being a part of Black Voices for Trump, I made that decision because I thought that was the most effective way to help him win re-election. I believe that he is important for America, that he's done tremendous things for Blacks, and that the country was on the right trajectory before the coronavirus and the hysteria around it. And I believe that keeping the coronavirus and the fear and all of these lockdowns and restrictions, that has gone beyond trying to keep people safe, that it's all politically motivated now. The Democrats see an opportunity to get everything they ever wanted on their socialist wish list by keeping the country shut down, and that's a part of what's going on. So I am a proud member of Black Voices for Trump, and I was also, up until recently, the Black Outreach Director for the Mighty American Strike Force, and that's a group that sends out volunteers to battleground states. I'm moving into the position of outreach for college students, and I'm on that steering committee. But as long as the world is kind of organized around race, I felt like, and this was a prayerful decision, that I can do more by being on Black Voices, being a part of Black Voices for Trump, and being a part of outreach to Blacks than I can by maintaining my individuality.
Okay, you said a whole lot right there. There's the coronavirus piece, which I want to set to the side for the moment. I want to talk about the Trump piece. A lot of people are scratching their heads. In the spirit of Joe Biden, they're saying to themselves, have you lost your mind? You can't tell the difference between a racist, and that's Donald Trump of Charlottesville fame, Donald Trump of Central Park 5 fame, Donald Trump, the racist. I mean, we know he's a racist from the travel ban. We know he's a racist from his antipathy to migrants. Come on, man, as Joe Biden would say, Donald Trump's a racist. So I want you to deal with that. And I want you to talk about what is it about Trump's policies that appeal to you? I mean, specifically, building up the military, building the wall, cutting off the dealings with NATO. What is it, what is in the interest of Black people in the Trump movement?
Well, I mean, there are a lot of things that you've asked me there, and I can tell you that I am the expert on white nationalism. And there have been some books written after mine that didn't cite my work. And so there might be a way that you can become an expert on white nationalism and skip that Cambridge Press book. But I am the expert on white nationalism, and Donald Trump is not a white nationalist, nor are the overwhelming majority of his white supporters. And when you're running for office, you can't control, who's going to support you. They look at the alternatives. A lot of us didn't want to vote for Hillary Clinton. And so the first thing, the label that they've tried to apply to him as being a white supremacist and white nationalist, there's no evidence for that. And when you look at Charlottesville and how the president handled it, I guess he made a statement that there were bad people on both sides, and that was used to say... Good
people. He said there were good people on both sides.
Okay, whatever he said. Okay, good people on both sides. Well, I understand, what he meant, and that was used against him. First of all, the group that was protesting, I believe they were part of what they were protesting was the pulling down of monuments, that were related to the Civil War. And so that was a big issue during that time. the main group had a permit to be there. There were all these other groups that showed up, maybe Black Lives Matter, Antifa, all of those groups, and they incited violence. And even the guy that, drove the car into the crowd, and we haven't heard a lot of information about him and his trial, but some of what did come out was that someone had pointed a gun towards him, and the driver was surrounded by crowds and he panicked. And so you cannot go by anything that the media reports. Everything has more detail than what we get from the media. And I think with Charlottesville, you did have bad people on both sides. No one that has studied Antifa would call them good people. And they were not there for the right motivation. And we know with Black Lives Matter that they have taken a truth statement. Of course, Black Lives Matter, as a fact, like all lives matter. But this organization has had a very Marxist agenda, and they have incited violence. And the groups that were there in Charlottesville, some of them were there, to make trouble. And that's a fact. And so I don't think it's fair to say that, the president is a white nationalist because these people showed up. And what really bothers me about President Trump and his election is the fact that we know that the resistance to him started before he was inaugurated. It started the day after he was elected. And I've never seen anything like it. These 4 years, the president has been attacked from every side, yet he's made tremendous progress. And what he was trying to do with immigration is something that should have been done a long time ago. One of my books, it's an edited book, Cambridge Press, Debating Immigration. It looks at all sides. These books, there's 2 of them, looks at all sides of the immigration issue. It's been clear that for, more than 20, 25 years, something needed to be done about immigration. Neither political party was willing to take action. And so what candidate Trump and President Trump was trying to do were things that needed to be done. And when he put on the travel ban involving Islam, that needed to be done. When he stopped flights from China, that needed to be done. And so I think the evidence of Donald Trump being a racist is very weak. And if you look at the support he's given,
Carol?
Well, let me get to that. The support he's given Jesse Jackson and Al Sharpton and many Black individuals to help them get their businesses started over the years, he was never labeled as a racist until he became a Republican nominee. And then all of a sudden, everything that he had done good involving race, that was forgotten. If you're a Republican and you're white, you're automatically considered a racist. And if you're a Republican and you're Black, you're just an Uncle Tom. And when you talk about the Central Park 5, or you talk about the policy he or his father may have had in place when it came to renting apartments or homes.
Which is a separate thing, but okay.
I would say that you have to look at the era. During that time with the Central Park 5, everyone thought they knew the story of what happened.
Yeah.
And I remember just how horrific that attack was. And so I think that if you look at what other leaders and other people were saying at the same time, that whatever he did, whether it was putting out an ad or financing, part of the case, what did he do?
He took out an ad. I don't know all the details in which he said they, in effect, bring back the death penalty to the horror of crime in our time, of which the Central Park 5 were exemplary. But I may not have all the details on that right. But you're right. Hillary Clinton was talking about super predators at roughly the same time. And everybody was concerned about what was going on in New York City in the late 80s and early 90s. So I take that point. But I got to say a couple of things. One is I really appreciate you coming on the Glenn Show and talking about this stuff. I really think people need to hear from you and others of similar ilk. They don't even know you exist, Carol, and that's significant. I am not endorsing everything you're saying. I want to put that on the record. I'm not countering everything. I'm not countering everything you're saying either. I'm not against it or for it. I think you need to be heard. That's all I want to say.
Well, yeah.
I can speak for myself.
I can tell you that it seems like ever since I was born, people have tried to silence me. And during the time I was at Princeton, the early years, I was painfully shy. And after I had my born again Christian conversion experience in 1999, it's like God removed my shyness, and he impressed on me that he had given me a message bigger than me. And as long as I focused on the message, I could speak. And when I didn't speak, it was always because I was fearful. People would laugh at me because of my accent. I would mispronounce a word. I would make a grammatical mistake. All of that kept me silent. I reached a point, I don't care. I'm going to speak. I'm going to do what I think is best for the country as a whole.
Well, God bless you in that. I got to ask you something, though. This is still on Donald Trump. He's a boob. He's bumbling. He's inarticulate. He's narcissistic. He's unfit for the position. You've heard of the Never Trumpers, right? I mean, you can't get away from them. They're everywhere.
Some of them.
He's a danger to the republic. He is an embarrassment to the Republican Party. Mitch McConnell should be ashamed of himself. The guy in Wisconsin, Paul Ryan, should have been ashamed of himself for collaborating with this guy. He doesn't read books. He's ignorant. He watches too much television. He tweets while sitting on the toilet. Come on, man. This is Donald Trump, the clown show. This is P.T. Barnum as president of the United States. What do you have to say to that?
I love Donald Trump. The first time I met Donald Trump, and that was last October, I met him in person. And when I went to shake his hand, he said, "I've seen you before. You do a great job."
So he charmed your socks off.
No, but even before that, I like the fact that he's real, and he's unscripted. And in a lot of ways, I am real and I'm unscripted and I'm transparent, and I value that more than I value someone that's slick and polished and they always get it right and they know the right thing to say. And I don't believe in speech codes or censorship. And you should have Jared Taylor on your show. I think people should be allowed to speak, and that we make a mistake, because I would much rather know what a person is thinking than have them conceal who they really are. They can. You
know what would happen if I had Jared Taylor on my show? Do you know what would happen? There would be, I don't know if my colleagues at bloggingheads.tv would want to associate with me anymore. I think there would be a firestorm of protest. My reputation as an academic economist would be damaged. My standing with my colleagues and students here at Brown would be placed in jeopardy. I would be accused of aiding and abetting white supremacy, Carol. I mean, now courage is one thing, but suicide is another.
Well, let me tell you that during the early days, right after my book was published, and I wanted people to see the real face of the new white nationalism, that it was not the guy with the beer gut and the missing teeth that you see on TV. That's the Klansman. That I wanted them to see this polished gentleman, educated at Yale. And I brought him to Vanderbilt to debate a civil rights activist. So it was a debate. And my students, they were taking a course on hate groups in America that I was teaching. And they came away with the impression that Jared Taylor really won the debate, because the civil rights activists just threw out epithets. I think you would be an excellent person to debate Jared Taylor. So maybe it's not going to be on your show, but I think his ideas are worthy of being debated. Plus, I also believe that he is a person that can change his mind. I don't think he's so wedded to his positions that he's unredeemable. And so as a Christian, Jared Taylor is someone that I spent years praying for. And when I see him, I speak to him. I warmly greet him. I don't hate him. I don't hate people like him. I try to understand where they're coming from. And so that's how I see it.
Okay, Carol, I'm going to call it a conversation here. We've been talking for an hour or so. Glenn Loury at The Glenn Show with Carol Swain, retired professor of politics and law from Vanderbilt University, former professor at Princeton University, author of many books, a former mayoral candidate, Nashville, Tennessee, a born-again Christian and evangelist, and a Black American conservative, and a wonderful human being. I'm glad we were able to share some time together, Carol.
Well, thank you, Glenn, and I really appreciate having you in my life, and just, all of us working together can only bring good to this nation.